Hi everyone. So welcome to Midweek Matters for today, for Wednesday. So just like I say, as a way of introduction, so some of the world's most serious health and social issues are ignored or hidden from public view. And as a result, many people who need help are afraid to seek it. So, Talking to Booze uses a research, design, and behavioral science to shine a light on the beliefs and attitudes that fuel these taboos. There's work. Their work currently sits within the physical and mental health sphere, and not only is it important to talk about taboos, but also know how to help people who suffer from taboos feel seen when they choose to share their perspective. So, Hannah Marcus is a trustee at Talking Taboos, and she is a qualitative researcher with a special interest in semiotics, health and sexual well-being, culture and tech, research and strategy. And it's our great pleasure to have Hannah joining Midweek Matters this evening to share the groundbreaking and important work that Talking Taboos does. And having sat on a panel as part of Talking Taboos back in June, which I've kind of alluded to already, and we will definitely talk about in more detail. I am personally really excited to have Hannah here. So Hannah, over to you.
Oh, thank you so much, Nat. And yeah, it's really lovely to be here and to meet you all. Yeah, I've known Miriam sort of since I was a teenager, actually. So
Oh,
um, I used to yeah. So it was really lovely to hear more about the work that she does with UP, and then I was telling her about the work I did with Talking Taboos, and we sort of realised that there could be these kind of commonalities and overlaps. So that's why I'm here today. So what I thought I would do is tell you all a bit about the charity. I've got some slides. They're a little text heavy because they kind of come from our internal documents, but they're more to prompt me. So don't worry if you're not if there's too much text on the slide. And then I'll show you the report that we made that inspired the event that Nat spoke at, and then Nat and I will have a bit of a chat about the event and her experience of that and what we sort of learned, I guess, about how um, you know the work that UP does and the work that we do kind of overlap in that way, I think. So yeah, I'll just share my screen and and as Nat said, we'll do questions after, just so that we can be really clear, if we want to keep the video separate. But if at any point something I've said isn't clear, or I'm talking too fast or anything like that, please do just let me know. So yeah, so Talking Taboos, what are we for? So we exist to increase discussion and reduce the impact of harmful taboos by identifying, surfacing, and understanding the taboos that affect physical or mental health. And what that essentially means is that, there are so many topics that there are so many issues that different charities work on across physical and mental health that affect people. And so much of what then happens, that is then affected by things that have to be silenced, or are kind of have shame or have stigma. And what we find is that what we see our role is supporting organizations who are working on different issue areas, whether that's cerebral palsy, whether that's period poverty, whether that's cancer research, and sort of saying the taboo element is just one part of the thing that you work with. So how can we help you talk about the taboos so that we can so that actually you don't have to worry about countering the taboos in your work, but you can work on sort of helping people with the ways that actually affects their lives. So I've just got a little bit of what is a taboo, because actually it's something that people can often use that term and define it differently. But the way that we define taboos are customs that prevent people from talking and thinking about a subject or recognizing it in themselves, making people feel judged, excluded, ashamed, and inadequate. So it's particularly that kind of social or external pressure to not talk about a subject, and then what happens when that subject isn't talked about. So yeah, this is a very text heavy slide, but we just talk about what's the impact of certain topics being taboo? So if the topic is shrouded in silence, that means that people can feel really isolated, they can feel alone in their experiences. If it's taboo, that means that people often don't have the right language or a framework for a safe discussion, so they might be unsure about how to speak about the topic, which means they might be scared to raise it, and it also might mean that if someone else does raise it, people might not know how to respond. It can lead to hesitation and help seeking, or even recognizing what's happening to yourself. There can be a penalty for speaking about the taboo. So even if you personally decide to bring up the topic, if other people then respond badly, then you could experience shame or stigma or judgment. And some of them, sometimes it can be unsurvivable if the taboos cause really, really serious health and social harms. So some examples that we've given is that menstruation might be considered okay to discuss with close friends, but not in a sports club or in a workplace, or breastfeeding might be accepted in private, but not in public spaces, or it might be okay for 6 months, but for a year it's not. Or it's okay to be lonely if there's a cause, but not for it to go on for a long time. And we've got on the side here a list of so many different topics that are taboo. So from bowel health, STIs, loneliness, suicide, self-harm, death, menstruation, breastfeeding, men's health, abortion, sexual abuse, baby loss, mental health, domestic abuse, and many more. Um, and then the other thing that we just like to clarify is that um, the language of taboo, stigmas, and myth often get used together and sort of talked about together. So we often find it's really useful before we start the discussion to really be clear on what the difference between those things are. So taboos are those topics that are shrouded in silence, not discussed, or incur social penalties if they are discussed. Stigma is a set of negative or unfair beliefs about a topic, and taboo topics are also often stigmatized, which contributes to keeping them silent. And then myths are false information that can often take hold in the presence of taboos and contribute to stigma if they have negative connotations. So, for example, it not being acceptable to talk about mental health in the workplace might be an example of a taboo. Stigma would be if you talk about your mental health in the workplace and then people start to judge you and say, oh, that's really bad. How could they say that? That would be the stigma. And then myth might be something like people being like, all people with mental health issues are bad workers and also they just need to get over it, would be the example of a myth. So you can see how they sort of interact with each other, but they're not quite the same thing. So the other thing that we're a charity called Talking Taboos. What we're trying to do is create conversations about taboos, but we also know that talking about them is not a neutral act. And so it's really important that when we talk about taboos, we have to do it in a way that breaks down the taboos, reduces stigma, and creates space for accurate information and the voice of lived experience. So we definitely don't want to talk about them in a way that actually perpetuates myths or worsens that stigma. So our vision is to trigger a movement where people, organisations and society are comfortable talking about taboos, where people feel able to share their experiences without fear of judgment, and so that they experience better mental and physical health. Society is more accepting and supportive, and so that the negative consequences of taboos are avoided. And I think that's, this is what we're trying to say about the fact that we want to work with other organizations, because we know that if you get rid of the taboo, that's only just getting rid of one element of the thing that affects people, but there's so much else going on that it's like, can we at least try to make the taboos easier? I'm gonna skip on a little bit. This is something that we talk about. We've got some sort of, we like to share some guidance of sort of how to talk about taboos, and different things that can help. And so it includes the speaking up. So we'll talk about this a bit now when we talk about the event, but we try to talk really openly about taboos as a charity and also share personal stories of taboos, break social norms and lead by example. So whenever I'm chairing a panel, I'll always try to start by sharing my own story of how the particular taboo that we're talking about affects me, and we can talk a bit about which ones I shared when we talk about that event, but so that everyone can see that that's, no one feels like they have to share, but they can if they want to. Never assume. We sort of want to respect everyone's right to talk about taboos in their own time, and that you don't have to talk about the taboo, but also if you're not talking about it, that doesn't mean you're not affected. To really listen empathetically, so it really takes guts to speak about taboos. So also making sure that if someone else talks about their taboos, you know, we want to be in the space to receive it, to use the right words that are not euphemistic, to not kind of use humor to just kind of laugh off the discomfort. I think humor can be a really powerful tool sometimes to help break those barriers, but it can also sometimes end up dismissing the topic. So that's really important to us. Respecting people's privacy. So if someone's shared something, it's still their story, and thinking about when you can pass that on. Speaking out against the penalties for sharing taboos, and also considering the context that we're all starting from. So what we actually do as a charity is we sort of reframed what we were doing a few years ago. So we used to just do deep dive research reports into specific issues. And a couple of years ago, we decided that we wanted to take this cross taboo lens. And what that means is thinking about what are the taboos in today's society that people want to talk about and need to be talked about. So what we do every year, starting from last year, is we create a report that we call Today's Taboos, and we do research. And I'm very happy to talk about and answer questions on the methodology, but we do research into what do we think for that year today's taboos are. And then over the course of the year, we do deep dive events into those taboos. So we'll then sort of curate together a panel of people who have diverse lived experiences, and also diverse experiences of the taboo that we're talking about. And we'll use that as an opportunity to really dig into the taboo and say, how is this affecting different people? How does that context come to life? How does that, what are the commonalities and what are the differences? And there's, Natalie spoke so brilliantly about how her experiences with daily disgusts resonate with and also differed from what the other people on our panel did. So what I thought that I would do, if that's okay, is just very quickly talk you through last year's report. We're about to launch next year's report, but I'll talk you through last year's, and then maybe we can pause to see if there's anything that we want to chat about, and then, or Nat, we can kind of start chatting about the event and see.
Yeah,
Does that sound
no,
all right?
that's perfect. Thank you.
Cool.
Great.
All right. So I'm just going to pause my share while I get the next report up. Sorry, I have 1,000 tabs open. Nope, not that one. This one. Okay. Can everyone see the report?
Yeah, we can.
Cool. All right. So yeah, I won't talk too much about the methodology, but essentially, last year we basically did a social media analysis to see what type of topics were coming up between 2022, January and December 2022, on Twitter, news media, blogs and forums in the UK, and looked for the themes that were occurring that were not necessarily the biggest, but felt like they were really present and had lots of conversation. For next year's report, we have a much more robust methodology in which we still looked at social media, because quite often social media is where people feel comfortable talking about taboos that they don't talk about elsewhere. But we also interviewed experts and then put a poll out and use that data to triangulate what the taboos for that year would be. So we're sort of every year kind of iterating the methodology. So what we ended up with last year were 4 themes: unmentionable mental health, shameful sex, unruly bowels, and daily disgusts. So yeah, unmentionable mental health. Actually, just go through them one by one. So unmentionable mental health was essentially about the idea that as there's more and growing conversations about uh, some conditions like anxiety and depression, actually there's sort of increasing taboo and stigma around um, conditions like schizophrenia, psychosis, BPD, personality disorders, things like that, and the idea that the sort of growing openness and removal of taboo around some mental health conditions was increasing some of the stigma and taboo around other conditions. And so we had some quotes that were taken from those online sources that we were looking at. So people sort of saying that there's still a substantial taboo around very severe mental health issues, and all the raise awareness stuff hasn't chipped away at. Or people talking about how healthcare professionals are specifically kind of mad that despite being told by professionals that I fit the BPD criteria, it's probably better off that I don't get the official diagnosis due to the stigma in the mental health care system, and that professionals will literally refuse to treat people with BPD. So really seeing how that particular taboo is kind of evolving over time. We then had shameful sex, which actually we've got an event that we've got our final event of the year on this one next week. So if anyone wants any details about that, just get in touch and we can let you know. So this one is about kind of how, even though there have been sort of growth in conversations about sex positivity, actually the spaces where sex doesn't feel like you can't talk about it in that uncomplicatedly um, positive language is still really fraught with taboo, and whether that's around STIs, which are still considered very embarrassing and shameful, judgment of particular people, sexual dysfunction, and also the idea that, you know, for some people it's not easy actually to just be positive about sex, and how do we create room for kind of ambivalent conversations that don't contribute to shame but take in all of these different issues. Um, so yeah, so you wouldn't feel shame telling someone you caught a cold. You wouldn't feel shame if you told someone you sprained an ankle. So why is there so much shame surrounding sharing an STI diagnosis? We then had unruly bowels, which is about gut health and digestive issues and the taboos around poo. And what we found that was really interesting with this was that, you know, it feels like there's this greater conversation around wellness and gut health and sort of digestive health, but actually that conversation is very aesthetic. And actually, if you're having issues with your gut, or you've got, you know, a condition like Crohn's or colitis or bowel cancer, but you don't look like a sort of Instagram influencer who is sort of presenting themselves with their probiotic shake or whatever, then actually people still don't want to hear it. So it's kind of, it's opened up the conversation, but only in a very small space. And actually that sort of unruly, smelly kind of side of it is not being talked about. So yeah, there's behind the beaming smiles, the 29-year-old model and influencer was silently suffering with symptoms of ulcerative colitis and inflammatory bowel disease. And then the last one, daily disgusts, which we'll talk about in more detail in a moment, is this taboo around personal hygiene, which strongly impacts those who identify as women or have vulvas, and is essentially the suggestion that normal bodily functions and odors are unclean. So we talked a lot about the idea that a vulva or vagina shouldn't smell, the use of odor prevention products, the impact of menstruation, which is treated as unclean despite being common, normal, and natural. And I think, you know, what we really talked about in the event was the fact that, you know, these are all things that happen to everyone. Like everyone has bodily functions. Everyone goes to the toilet. Everyone smells. Everyone needs to clean themselves. You know, 50% of the population have periods, but it's still somehow considered in some way dirty or disgusting to talk about it. And we talked a lot about how, yeah, that then intersects with different people's experiences of what a body is meant to look like and what it's meant to do and what you're expected to hide. Um, so yeah, so again, we just talked about people talking about selling products that make young women think that it's somehow unclean for a vagina to smell as nature intended, as a wonderful self-cleaning organ. It's not meant to smell like fucking flowers. So yeah, so that's our report. Um, and yeah, I think I'll probably stop there because I've been talking for a really long time. Um, what do you think, Nat? Should we get some questions and then maybe talk about the event, or what
Yeah,
do you
we
think would be
can
good?
do. We can see if anyone has any questions, and then if not, we can talk about the event. That's not a problem. So if anyone's got any questions, feel free to stick your hand up or just pop it in the chat, whatever works best for everyone. We'll give it a couple of minutes. Let me pin myself so I'm back here.
If I may ask you a question, you say that the report is produced annually. Is that produced at the beginning of January, or is it produced by the end of December when you've done all the consultations and been speaking to groups and been to focus groups? And so is the report, what comes first, the report or the actions?
Yeah,
Does
that
that
makes
make
sense.
sense? Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, that's a really good question. So we're actually just getting into our rhythm with it because we're about to release our second ever report. But the idea is that we research the report during the year and then launch it in December. So we should be launching it yeah, this December. The report should be coming out. And then the following year we do the events around um we do the events throughout the year and then we finish the year with the next report. Because the other thing that we do at our events, as well as diving into the taboos, is we ask people to anonymously share taboo topics that they think are important to them or that they would like to see more conversations about, so that we don't, when we're designing the report, we're actually not just consulting with experts, but we're also consulting with our community to see, what's coming up for them
Yeah.
this year and how should that be part of it.
Thank you. That's really useful because I didn't know which way it came round, but yeah, that's good.
That makes sense.
No, that's
Thank you.
cool. Thank you. Um, I might ask a question actually, if
Mm.
that's okay. I'm really interested. I I don't know why I didn't even think about this when we met before, but looking at like the methodology and stuff and the way in which you decide what the taboos are going to be like for that report and things, and like I don't know, like maybe if you could talk a little bit more about that, because I'm assuming from that first year to this next one the methodology has changed, and also I guess like has there been any sort of point where you've kind of thought like, oh, for want of a better way of putting it, like, oh, we've missed the mark on this particular, do you know what I mean? So yeah, I don't know, it'd be cool to hear a little bit about that.
Yeah, absolutely. So actually, the first report, we it was a very kind of experimental methodology. So what we did was we worked with a company called Discover AI, who I used to work for, and um we created a set of keywords that were just very generic keywords. They were literally
Hmm.
like taboo, shame, stigma, physical health, mental health. And then the social listening platform went and found content that was related to those words, and then I manually analyzed it.
Right.
And when we had our launch event, we got a lot of questions on the methodology, and people were very interested to understand how we'd pick the taboos from the social media, and how that had come out, and what was Twitter and what wasn't. And back then
Hmm.
Twitter was still Twitter back then, so it was um And we were very honest that, it was purely qualitative. It was honestly, it was my assessment of what I was seeing. And we had discussions internally, and we had sort of a long list of maybe 20, and we narrowed to that four. And someone said to us, straight away, like, what is the what have you done towards inclusivity when creating this report? And they were particularly interested in ethnic diversity.
Right.
And I was very honest, and I said, there's an element to which I just couldn't do that, because on social media, you know, you can only know as much about people as they choose to tell you. And it's actually, if someone has said, I'm a certain race, or I'm a certain gender, or I'm, have a certain condition on their profile, you can maybe get that. But most people don't share to that level. And, there's some very dodgy, like, I would never want to infer, even based on someone's name, what gender they are and things like that.
Yeah,
So
no, of course.
we just physically couldn't do that. So what we said in the room was, we were like, our commitment is that the events that we do where we deep dive into these taboos are designed to fill those gaps in that way, and actually talk to people from different communities about how they do that. And then when we design the methodology for the next year, it's really with that in mind. So this year we did the social media piece again, but we also spoke to 4 or 5 experts, and we ensured that we had a mixture of ages, genders, backgrounds, ethnicity. I mean, it was only 5 experts. You can't cover everything, but it was more diverse than just me. And also, a couple of the people that we spoke to were clinicians or healthcare practitioners, so they were themselves working on the front line with a real variety of people.
Right.
And then we put out this survey, and then and we'll talk about this more at our launch event, but I'm really happy with the methodology, actually, because we asked people 2 questions. We asked them, what topics, would you feel uncomfortable being in a conversation about? And what topics do you wish that there were more conversations about?
Right.
And we gave them a list based on our interviews and based on our events through the year. We gave them a short list to prioritize from.
Yeah.
And so the topics that we've got for next year are a mix of the topics that people were the least comfortable talking about, the topics that the people wanted the most to have more conversations about, and they were not the same topics, actually. The topics that people wanted more conversations about, they were also a bit more comfortable being in conversations about.
Yeah.
And then we looked at topics that specific groups, like, over-indexed more to specific groups who are often unrepresented. So we looked at topics that, for example, men or people from minoritized ethnic groups were saying were more important to them, or were more taboo for them, even if those weren't the biggest ones in our areas as a
Yeah.
whole. And so that's how we're building it up. And I'm hoping that as we grow as an organization in reputation, the more people will respond to our surveys, and then the more people's voices will be
Yeah,
able to
absolutely.
include as we do that prioritization.
Definitely. It does definitely feel like something that will just sort of grow quite organically, isn't it? So, no, that's really cool. Thank you. That's really helpful. Does anyone else have any questions for the time being? If not, it's cool. We can, should we talk about the event? Yeah. No, that's great. So yeah, I mean, do you want to give a bit of background about the event perhaps, and then I don't, yeah.
Yeah, sounds good. So yeah, so we had an event to talk through the taboo of daily disgusts. It was hosted in the Vagina Museum, which felt like the right location for that particular topic.
Definitely.
And we had a range of speakers. So obviously we had Natalie. We had a woman called Dr. Yancy Ralston, who is a clinical psychologist who has been working on diverse menopause experiences, particularly Black women's menopause, but also queer menopause experiences and things like that. And she's produced short films on those. We had an artist and songwriter called Freddie, who is a trans man, who talked about his experiences of periods and how that stigma and shame manifests for someone who's got a different gender identity. We had a woman called Alia who works for Bloody Good Period, but also in her personal life, she does like street interviews on social media. So she sort of goes up to people on the street and asks about their periods. So she talked about her work tackling period poverty. She talked about her work sort of trying to push this taboo on social media, and she also talked about like her experience as a young Black woman of the taboos in their community. And then we also had a woman called Sarah who is more of a medical researcher, and she shared sort of her work campaigning and advocacy for against those kind of clean narratives that we were talking about before. So yeah, so that was the panel. And yeah, I've just seen that we've got another question. So shall I answer that and then we can...
Yes, please. So Abby has just said, do you think society has become scared about sharing something past 5, 10 years than 50 years ago, etc.?
Yeah, really interesting question. I think what we found or what we find is that taboos go in cycles, right? So for all of our taboos in last year's report, all of them have an element of, as something becomes taboo, something else becomes, so as something becomes less taboo, something else becomes more taboo, right? It kind of moves the edges of it. And I also think that the way that we talk about things changes, because I think, particularly for something like menstruation or women's health, people were used to getting the information that they needed from their friends and their mothers and sort of privately. And if you were lucky enough to have good, knowledgeable people who told you about it privately, then great. And if you didn't, then
tough luck.
yeah. And so it was very luck of the draw, but it wasn't like there wasn't even a question of, I mean, like go back far enough. It's like, well, women weren't in the workplace, so why would we care about talking about menstruation in the workplace? And then in the same way, social media didn't exist, so why would it matter if you could talk about your period on social media or not? So it's like, I don't think that it's, I don't think things were less taboo in the past, but I think people worked out their rhythm of how do we get what we need in this context, and then as the norms changed, those created new situations to talk about those taboos. Does that answer your question, Abby?
Yeah, then yeah, I think that people are a bit more frightened about what is wrong with them, and not even what's wrong with them, but but they people are not trying to tell others.
Yeah.
Definitely, yeah. And I feel like from my perspective, just to jump in as like a participant that was on that panel, actually being given that space to talk about that stuff, like even in 2024, feels like, I don't know if that's just having that space as a disabled person, like, when you put that kind of layer onto that as well to talk about all this stuff, like it felt groundbreaking. And it's like, it shouldn't feel groundbreaking, but actually, like, it was nice to be able to have that.
Yeah. But
Definitely.
I do think, Abby, I think to your point that, on the one hand, we have breaking more taboos, and on the other hand, yes, we do have concerns about cancel culture and people being scared about saying the wrong thing, and the sort of, as people become more aware that there's like the right and the wrong language, some people do feel scared. And I think that's really why we want to both talk about how to share taboos and also how to hear taboos, because that's, yeah,
Yeah.
we don't want.
Yeah, people are nervous about the backlash. That's so
Exactly.
true. So
Exactly.
true.
I mean, I personally, I think that people are nervous about the backlash, but often the backlash is so focused on being online,
Yeah.
and the backlash is you don't get to be, the consequences still happen on social media, but they don't actually affect your real life. And I think that's the thing. I think the fear of the backlash is not necessarily always the reality. And I also think that, there are people who have always had to be really careful about what they say and watch what they think
Mhm.
about, because there might be consequences. And I think something that's happening in the last few years is that people who in the past had never had to think about what they said and the consequences, because there were never any consequences, are now learning that they do have to think about what they say and they don't like it. And that's the other side of the of the of that conversation. But I think there is also some genuine backlash, and there's some,
Mm.
and I think even, for me, moderating an event like that, and having such a diverse panel, like, I always want to be really careful that I'm using the right language and that I'm treating all of the people on the panel fairly, and we had to meet up beforehand to sort of say, what language should we use and how should we talk about that. And
Mhm.
um yeah, it's really easy to, I think we never want to be careless,
Mhm. Yeah.
but we also want to create space to have those conversations without, yeah, like, as talking taboos, we can't, we know that some people might be offended, and we just have to make sure that we're staying true to our values and doing the best we can. And actually, the people in the room are usually very lovely and generous and understanding, and
Mhm.
it doesn't become a space where people get offended. And we often say, what do we do if we get a difficult question or someone says something that might offend someone else? And it's not happened yet, actually, although,
Yet.
yeah, I'm sure as we grow there will be,
Yeah. But yeah, so Abby's just put in the chat that someone
mm,
could easily get offended over anything these days. And I think that for me, what talking taboos do actually do really well is, like you say, Hannah, is you foster that kind of, you set those expectations at those events that, you know, yes, it's almost that kind of getting comfortable with being uncomfortable, if that makes sense. And I think that was a really important like point to remember, that it's, you might get offended, but actually we're all in that safe space, and fostering that right atmosphere and that right attitude, I think, was really important.
mm,
um so I will come back to Julia's question, but Abby's just put 99% are lovely. It's the 1%, and that is a fair comment. That is a fair comment. So just coming back to Julia's question, do you think that disability and talking about sex in all its meanings and sexual health is still a taboo? Would you like me to answer that?
Do you want to start, I think?
Yeah, sure. Yes, absolutely. I do think it is still taboo. You know, we're all adults here. We all have sex, we all have wants and desires. And I think when you pair that with the fact that we are disabled, it is massively a taboo in my experience and opinion. I'm sure I'm not going to be the only one in this room that would say has been asked the question, does it work? Can you have sex? Because I'm sure we've all been asked that. But yeah, Hannah, do you want to come in on that?
Yeah, I think just to say that you know, in all my work on kind of sexual health and stigma, there's always this question of like, who gets to have sex, who gets to feel desire, who gets to be desired. And there are so many, well, there are lots of different groups and people that are excluded from that. And I think, you know, there's been work recently, very, very recently, to start talking about kind of menopause and older people and their sex lives. But I think that, yeah, talking about disability and sex is like nowhere near where it needs to be.
No,
Yeah.
no, absolutely,
Yeah.
absolutely. Which is a shame because
Mm,
at the end of the day, like I say, we're all human. Like, you know, it shouldn't be a taboo at all.
mm,
Sarah, I can see your hand up, but I'm just gonna go to Brian's question first and then I'll come to you. So Brian said, do you think having to be so careful about not offending is not good for your mental health?
mm.
That's an
Yeah.
interesting question.
It's a really good question. I think it
Hmm.
depends on I think that fundamentally what we all want is to feel safe in
Yeah.
conversation, right? And we all
Hmm.
want to be able to be met with, to have our good intentions met with good intentions and to have a safe conversation with people that we trust. And I think that what taboos do is they make certain topics feel unsafe and they
Yeah.
make interactions feel unsafe. And I think that I think what's really bad for your mental health is to not have a space where you can ever talk safely about the things that
Yeah.
you are going through or experiencing it and having to keep that all inside. And I think for some people, you know, that fear of offending, that fear of creating stigma, that all contributes to that feeling of lack of safety.
Hmm.
But I think that it's about how do we create as much of that conversational safety where people can give and meet you where they are for everyone. And I think that sometimes you know, I don't think that's happening here at all, but I think that some people can use, if they just keep the conversation about offense, that can sometimes also be used to sort of silence
Hmm.
people, and that's another part of it. So I think,
Yeah.
you know, that's really what we're trying to do at
Hmm.
Talking Taboos is, and in these events, is to create a space where, like, you know, on it, like right now I'm thinking carefully about, like, you know, how do I talk about, I'm not disabled, I don't have experience of that, I don't want to
Hmm.
say something that would inadvertently be harmful and create, you know, make this space less safe for
Yeah.
you all who have really kindly invited me into it. And I don't think that that's a bad thing for me to be thinking about, but I
Hmm.
also hope that we would be able to create a rapport that if I were to make a mistake, then someone would be able to
Would call
gently
you out.
say, you know, you know,
Yeah.
that's the
No, absolutely.
and that's, yeah,
Absolutely.
that's where I think we want to get to.
Yeah, and I think that does breed that kind of that conversational, it's a two-sided thing, right? And like when I've spoken with people before about offending people, so like you were saying, Hannah, language is so important and like, but we're all human at the end of the day. Like people make mistakes, and I think that's something that actually if a mistake is made and you end up offending someone, I don't think it's the end of the world. Like it's just like you say, owning that, creating that safe space, and okay, I might have offended someone, but what can I do to bring that back and keep that safe space? Definitely. Sarah?
Yes. Um, I have I've had many relationships with men, able-bodied men, and there still is that stigma between able-bodied men and disabled women, as if they're like predators.
Hmm.
You know, if I was disabled and they were disabled, it'd be a lot different. Society sees that differently.
Hmm.
Because if I went out with, if I went out with somebody my own size that got contemplated dwarf, nobody would bat an eyelid.
Yeah.
But if it's somebody like an able-bodied man that's quite confident, you know, that's quite mainstream,
Hmm.
then that is uh, a taboo still.
Definitely.
Like
Definitely.
he's using her. She wants a carer, you know, and
Hmm. Yeah.
what an horrible man he is at hurting her. But you know, people make. Um, I'm not saying my friends and family would, or where I live, but there are people that still think like that.
It's those preconceived judgments, isn't it? And I think that that's definitely Hannah not giving you more work, but I feel like from a disability perspective, that's definitely something that I think like could be put on the table to like be discussed in so much more detail, because it's something that, so my husband's not disabled, and you can tell like when we go out and about, and there is that real stigma, like Sarah says, about the kind of taboo of like, oh, he must be with her just to look after her, or and it's yeah, I completely agree with what you're saying, Sarah. I think that's really interesting.
Mm. Mm. Yeah, that's really interesting. Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, thank you. Does
Mm.
anyone else have any questions? We can talk more about the event. I mean, from my perspective, just even like being in that space was pretty transformative for me, which sounds really like, I don't know, sounds quite wishy-washy, I guess, but I just think, having the opportunity to be able to talk about those taboos and talk about, so I think, you know, one of the well, a lot of the stuff we spoke about was, well, all of it was great, to be honest. And I think it's one of those where, um, you know, a lot of the time I was actually finding that I was nodding along with what other people were saying. And it's that kind of that intersectional piece, which I think is really interesting. And I think from the event, obviously, a lot of the focus was around sort of like body functions and body odor and things like that, and I think that for me was especially prevalent, I guess, being a disabled person, because I remember we spoke quite a lot around like the whole thing around keeping clean and being a disabled person, so dealing with like fatigue and like during periods and stuff, trying to kind of keep more clean and things like that. And I think that was just something that really kind of struck a chord with me, and being able to, like I say, be in that safe space to be able to talk about that. And I remember one of the kind of anecdotes that I said, I thought it was something that it was because I was disabled that this was happening, but everyone else on the panel was like, no, that's something that happens to me as well. So just kind of having that kind of, you know, um I guess like reinforcement, isn't it? That actually that taboo that you've got inside of you, other people are feeling the same way, and having that kind of, yeah, I don't know, I feel like I'm going off in a tangent there. Um just to
Well, do
come
you want to share the anecdote?
Yeah, of
'Cause-
course. So, basically, and I'd be actually quite interested to know if anyone in this chat that has periods has experienced the same thing. So, basically, I figured out actually through talking with guys at Up that so when I am on my period and I would use period products and I would use pads. I always use pads, and I would find that they would move and they would shift. And I didn't realize, I thought that was normal, but actually it's because of the way that I walk and the patterns in which I walk that my pad would always shift to the right every time. And like I say, it's because of how I walk. Well, I thought it was because of how I walk, but actually, if everyone else is saying the same thing, like I just thought that was a really interesting um point, really, because actually it's something that, not to use the phrase normal, because what is normal, but actually it's something that everyone else resonated with. And there was me thinking, oh god, I'm going to leak all the time, but actually it is totally normal. So yeah, it was an
Yeah.
interesting one.
Well, we like to say common rather than normal because it's
Yes,
like
there you
it's
go.
happening to yeah.
Yeah.
But I think there's so much going on there, right? Because it's like you have this experience of your pad shifting around and being scared of leaking, and
Mhm.
you don't necessarily have anyone to talk about and like talk about it with, and you're not necessarily seeing people who look like you or have your experience to share that
Mhm.
with.
Yeah.
And then when we bring it into this room and you talk about it, other people are like, oh, my pads
Yeah.
shift around too.
Yeah.
And then it's like, well, yes, they do, but potentially for different reasons that your pads shift around, that's
Absolutely.
different. Like, and then also I think the consequences of leaking and the shame or stigma that might be felt
Mhm.
if that then happens, and also the ease of sort of cleaning it up and replacing it then might be different for
Yeah.
someone who's able-bodied versus someone who's disabled.
100%.
But ultimately, we're all being failed by the period companies who are building these products that
Yeah.
don't work for anyone's bodies, and everyone's just putting up with it
Just going along with it. Yeah.
because everyone's just going along with it, and
Exactly.
and it keeps
Yeah.
us, the taboo keeps us apart, and it
Uh-huh.
stops us finding the places where it's common,
Yeah,
and also the places where the impacts might be different, so I think, yeah.
definitely. Definitely. And I think it's another thing just to kind of highlight as well. And it's something that I didn't even think about, but you guys mentioned it during the event, is to shift that again, that language, and to use period products rather than sanitary products. Because using if you say sanitary products, sanitary towels, whatever like that, it kind of again gives that impression that actually having a period is an unsanitary thing. So yeah, just to kind of highlight that, I think that's something that really struck a chord with me. Um, just heading back to the chat quickly, Julia, going back to the previous point, what we were saying, she said being lesbian is the same people. So absolutely, completely agree. Um, and Abby has said, who has ever had the question, where's your mum/carer if you're out independently? And if I'm out with my partner, people think he's my carer. All the time. All the time. And I think that's definitely something, I can see some people nodding along quite frantically there. Like, I think we've all had that. And that's definitely something, again, it's those wider taboos, isn't it? Just around disability as a taboo itself. I think
Mm.
that is something that, again, not giving you more work, Hannah, but I think that's definitely something that could be explored. Absolutely. Um,
Mm.
And Nasally has said, trouble is, people say they have the same problem when they don't. That's really interesting as well. That's really interesting. Yeah. No.
Yeah. There's two different directions to go in there. I think, yeah. I think on the as you're saying, on the taboo of disability
Mhm.
itself, and I think
Yeah.
that it's something that
I
you know,
think it's interesting because, like, as a disabled person, I'm like, shouldn't be a taboo, but it really is.
yeah, and that's something that I'm still working out how
Uh-huh.
to talk about that in our work and in my work in a way that is that, as I said right at the beginning, it like
Mhm.
doesn't perpetuate the stigma or kind of make it worse. But I think
Yeah.
whenever I work on taboos, even before talking taboos, we always have this layer of like, what's the taboo, and then how is that taboo experienced by different types of people, and how is that taboo exacerbated by whatever
Mhm.
your particular lived experience is.
Yeah.
But I definitely have come across this tension of both, being disabled can increase the experience of a
Mhm.
taboo, and
Yeah.
also the taboos around disability itself that people don't want to talk about, and then they're
Yeah.
double exacerbated. And
Yeah.
I think that,
Absolutely.
for me, doing events like this, having conversations like this, listening to people's experiences, ensuring that disabled voices are represented as much as possible on our panels,
Mhm.
I think that's how we have to make sure that we're kind of including and challenging those things, because I think there are so many taboos, aren't there? And
Yeah, for
it
sure. For
yeah.
sure. Yeah.
Um
No, and I think, not to kind of turn this into a bit of an echo chamber kind of situation, but it's one of those, for me, like, for my kind of way, that if I look at disability itself and everything that comes with it as that taboo, like, you know, um, ultimately, like, we are an aging population, and it's like, it's almost that kind of education piece more than anything, really, because, when you look at, what is it, the people who are sort of, I think it's 65 plus, it's 1 in 2 people are disabled. So it's one of those things that actually it's a taboo, but it shouldn't be. And but I think that's with all the taboos, really, isn't it? They shouldn't be taboo.
no, completely, but we're here to talk about what we're here to talk about.
Yes,
um
exactly.
and then, yeah, to Nasalie's point about people say they have the same problem when they don't, I
Hmm.
think I think it's really interesting. I think there's a real challenge with kind of over like empathizing,
Hmm.
but that sort of false empathizing, and I'm sure that's something that lots of people have experienced. And I think that's how some people think it's a good way to relate to
Yeah,
people.
it
And
a really good example that always sticks in my mind when you're saying about that kind of over empathizing is when people will come up to you, um who will say, oh, I was in a wheelchair once because I broke my leg. So that's such a kind of putting that kind of into practice, because,
mm,
again, wheelchair users, I'm sure we've been there with people who have said that, oh, I know what it's like, but actually, like, no, there's so many layers to it. So yeah, for sure, for
mm,
sure.
yeah. And I think, I mean, this is there's a podcast I really like called Maintenance Phase. This is
Hmm.
a personal endorsement, not a talking to booze endorsement, but it's about anti-fat stigma and bias, and it's super
Hmm.
interesting, and I've learned a lot from it. And I think it something that it talked about that I try to use a lot when thinking about the limits of empathy is like, when thinking about someone's privilege, it's like, what's the worst thing that they can imagine as the
Hmm.
consequence of the thing that they're experiencing. So in this podcast, they're talking about body positivity, and they say that, obviously, in our patriarchal culture, lots of people feel insecure about their bodies. But, if you have thin privilege, but you feel insecure about your body, the worst thing that you can imagine is feeling insecure. But actually, if you're someone who's experiencing a structural bias, then you're scared about not getting the healthcare you need, or not being able to get on an airplane, or not being able to get a job. Like the limits of the imagination are so small. And I'm sure that, for those people with the wheelchair, it's like the worst thing that they can imagine is having their mobility restricted on a day-to-day basis. And actually, it's so much bigger than that. So yeah, I kind of try to, when I look at those things or ask those questions, try to ask myself, like, what's the worst thing that I can imagine, and what's the limits of that versus outside of it.
Definitely, yeah, completely agree. Abby's put in the chat, we need to get out of the whole, wow, you're disabled, but you can do that. And that's such a good point, isn't it? And I think that definitely goes back to that kind of sex conversation that we were having as well. It's nothing like exciting, but also because I know Abby outside of this space as well, just to kind of touch on that. So we go to the same gym, and it's very much from the kind of content that sometimes goes out through there. It's very much, oh my God, like, you're disabled, but you can do that at the gym. So that's something that's really interesting. And yeah, what Abby said there, for example, if you're wearing a dress in a chair, oh, are you not cold? Which, like, ultimately, does it really matter? Like, if you're a wheelchair user or not, if you want to wear a dress, wear a dress. Like, doesn't matter, does it? And then
I get that. It's like a wear a t-shirt, it's cold.
yeah.
And they could just come up to you and say, aren't you cold? And I go, well, if I am or if I'm not, then it's down to me.
If you are, you'll put a coat on.
Exactly.
And Julia's said conversations with the adult toy industry is desperately needed to make toys accessible, and I completely agree with that. There are, I don't know if I'm allowed to mention company names on here, but there are some companies who are out there doing really good stuff in that world. But I don't, because it's going on YouTube, so I'm not sure if I'm able to say the names. But I mean, I can put them in the chat. But like I say, there are definitely sort of conversations that do need to be had around that as a topic for sure. Because again, like I said, we're all adults. We all have like the agency to want to do that and to have desires. And that's something that if we have those desires and it's not accessible, then actually that's a huge barrier.
Yeah,
Definitely.
completely. But
Definitely.
yeah, there's definitely some really interesting design going on in that space. But it's also got to be accessible and affordable and for everyone, and
affordable. That's the other big thing as well with all of that, isn't it? Because it's like, okay, you design something, it's accessible, but then you put the disability price tag on it, and instantly it might be accessible, but it's not affordable. So people are still missing out on that. Definitely.
To be fair, sex toys are so expensive. Like that whole industry is.
That's true. That's very true. Very true. Are there any more questions? I mean, we can talk some more about the event. I mean, from my perspective with the event, I don't know, it was just a really nice event, really safe space. So I would always urge people, if you're local, to wear any. So Janine said, can we get involved in events, etc., with the charity? So yeah, you have got some events coming up, haven't you?
Yeah,
I
so
don't
we've
know
got
if you
one.
want to talk about those.
Yeah, so we've got the shameful sex event at the end of this month, which we can send around after when that is, or the link to our website, and then we will do our launch event for the next year's report in December, I think, so we can share some details of that as well.
That'd be great.
tend to be in the evening. We're going to sort of alternate. The in-person ones we always make sure have and are in accessible location, but they do have sort of we're an England and Wales charity, but we tend to do our events in London, but we try to alternate online and in-person events.
Is there any
So
scope for those to be hybrid at all?
eventually,
Yeah.
but we're really just starting to
No,
crack
of course.
the
Yeah.
technology. So at the moment we're alternating, but we're hoping to get better. And I think in terms of getting involved, I think the first thing is like, coming to our events as much as possible, spreading the word. We want the reach of them to be not just the event itself, but other people can learn from them. But also, coming into the room and, if Nat's been very kind in how she's spoken about the space, but if you feel comfortable asking questions and sharing your experiences, like saying that, so lots of these conversations we've been having about sex and accessibility today, like that needs to be in the room when we talk about it. And we can't, with a panel of 4 or 5 people, we can't represent every person every single time. So I think what we want to do is, build a community of people who come and have that conversation, so that it's almost like, here's a diverse panel, here's a diverse audience, everyone's sharing that experience, let's have those conversations together and keep that kind of fluid. But we also, we are, as we grow and as we build our capacity and our reputation, hopefully there'll be more opportunities to volunteer in other ways to sort of support us with the delivery of stuff. So please sign up to our mailing list, which you can do on our website. And if there's anything that you sort of see and think, oh, that's really my thing, and I think that you could really benefit from that, then please do reach out because we love talking to people. And that's, this, I'm here because Miriam and I had a conversation, and I told her about the reports, and she told me about these meetings and the conversations that people have about kind of women's health and disability. And from that, the idea of having Nat on the panel, and then so it kind of spirals from there. So I'm hoping that this is just the first conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. And it definitely, these things all do start with those conversations, isn't it? So just to kind of reiterate what Hannah was saying, definitely if you're keen to get involved, do reach out and start those conversations, because like she says, there's that kind of the charity is still in their infancy. So it's something that as it evolves, then obviously those opportunities will come through for sure. Definitely. Does anyone have any questions? I feel like I could, like I say, with the event, like, and I know, Hannah, you're saying that I'm being really kind about it, but actually, like, it just was, I can't reiterate enough just how welcoming and how much of a safe space it really was. So it was, yeah, really, really cool event. Abby's put in the chat, it's just not disability, but people frown on different interest in jobs. Yeah, that's very true. Very true. Yeah, exactly. Like women firemen. So yeah, so female firefighters, things like that. Completely true. And I think there's definitely that kind of, like you say, that's not just disability, is it? That's that kind of sexism piece as well, for sure. And I think that's a really interesting point. I don't know, Hannah, if you've got anything to talk to for either of those, or male. Yeah, Brian's put male nursing staff as well. That's really interesting.
Yeah. And I think there's
Definitely.
both there's the stereotypes and the judgment, right? And then there's the particularly for those types of roles like firefighters or nurses, there's all of the issues with safety equipment and the safety equipment not being built to fit certain types of bodies.
Yes.
Again, it's like, well, if you're not making safe personal protection equipment to fit an able-bodied woman,
Mhm.
then how are you going to include anyone who has any other kinds of,
Yes.
a disability or an access need or something like that, if it's like
Yeah.
it's so
Absolutely.
one size fits all that it's
Yeah.
literally so I think this stuff really and I think that's where the impact of these taboos and stigmas
Mhm.
spiral. It's like, do you see yourself in the job in the first place? Then if you manage to get it, are you met with judgment or disbelief, or people don't? And then you're in it, and then you're less safe than the
Yeah.
other people who are in it because
Yeah,
the equipment doesn't
exactly.
fit you.
Exactly. And I think on that kind of thing about, do you see yourself in that job? I think the phrase that I always use for anything to do with disability and, well, any kind of protected characteristic, anything like that, is if you can see it, you can be it. So I think that's such a, like, you know, there is that thing of, can you see yourself in that job, or can you see yourself in that particular space, things like that. But I think that whole thing around representation as well, like you say, it shouldn't be one size fits all. So actually having those opportunities available for people, I think is, yeah, it's a very important thing to do.
Mm.
Cool. Are there any more questions or comments? Keep racking my brains about other things we spoke about during the event. But yeah, like I say, like, yeah, not to sound like I'm just rinse repeating myself, but it was just nice for me as a disabled person, like, going like real personal here, to be invited into that space and to have my voice heard. And I think it's definitely something that I didn't go into it talking on behalf of the whole disability community, because obviously I couldn't on one person's opinions, one person's views, but actually just being able to be in that space, and, like I was saying, getting comfortable with being uncomfortable actually was something which was quite alien to me. And I remember telling people that I was coming to be on that panel. So many people, whether they were disabled or not, so many people were like, "Oh, that's a really interesting panel to be on." And I think that's, yeah, and it's, I'd say, "Oh yeah, I'm going on to this panel and it's going to be at the Vagina Museum," and so many people, like, and again, just the panel itself was a massive taboo for a lot of people that I was talking to. So being able to kind of break those down, I think is, yeah, it was really
Mm.
good. It was good.
Yeah, that's such a good point actually, because I think that's the one thing that it's really easy for me to forget working in this space, is that, like, I talk about taboos all the time,
Yeah.
and my and I've had professional experiences where I've come in as a consultant to help people work on a taboo topic, and I've been like, I showed some people, there's a body form advert called Womb Stories, which if you've not seen, I'd really recommend watching, and it's all stories about different positive and negative experiences that you can have having a period. And I was like, oh yeah, this is like a really chill, like mid-level taboo breaking thing. Like this is really easy. And I showed it to the room of people, and they all just sat there like, that was so intense. And also you just made me watch that with my boss. And like, and for me it was like a real like learning moment of like, oh
Mhm.
yeah, actually you can't just throw people into these topics, and actually
Yeah.
everyone's got to meet you where they are. And just because my personal brand is talking about my period in the workplace does not mean that everyone else's is going to
Yes.
be.
Yeah.
And that's why, again, I always try to, we opened the panel with me talking about I think I had thrush when we were doing that panel, and I was like, now everyone knows that as
Yeah.
well.
Yeah.
And
And I think that's definitely that kind of, like, for want of a better way of putting it, that icebreaker, that actually you, as someone chairing the panel, to come in with that essentially lived experience of, your own experience of the particular taboo, actually does kind of make people think, oh yeah, this is actually fine to talk about. And that definitely did kind of foster that that real kind of emphasis that it is a safe space. And I think you being able to share your experience actually did kind of push people to be able to do the same. Definitely. Yeah.
But I think that what you saying that, Nat, has reminded me is that actually when we're asking people to be on these panels, like that is a big thing actually that we're
Yeah.
asking people to do, and I think
Yeah.
we need to make sure that we are always respectful of that as individuals, that you know we're asking you to come and share some quite personal stuff that
Yeah.
many people are not comfortable sharing publicly, because that's the whole point. And how do
Definitely. Yeah.
how
And
do we safeguard, and how do we appreciate that?
and I think like what you're saying about just meeting people where they are, I think that again is so important, because you're not pushing people to get themselves uncomfortable, but in a way you kind of are, but like really gently and really like softly, and in a way, yeah, meeting people where they are, but also still sort of pushing a little bit, but like I say, in that kind of gentle, reassuring, like supportive way. Definitely.
Yeah.
Definitely. That's cool. Does anyone else have any questions, any thoughts or comments they want to bring up about anything we've spoken about? And if not, that's totally fine as well. While I'm giving people just a couple of minutes if they want to put anything in the chat or anything like that, I just want to kind of remind people that if you are uncomfortable with any of the kind of discussions that have been involved sort of tonight, if you're uncomfortable with any of it going on to YouTube that you might have been involved in, just let us know, and then we'll be able to edit up to the appropriate spaces. But I mean, I feel like we've only got 5 minutes left, but I just want to thank Hannah for your time. Thank you very much. I mean, Hannah, if you're able to just pop in the chat, the Talking Taboos website would be really helpful. And then obviously anything else that you want to share, I'm sure Emma and Miriam will be able to kind of share with the participants afterwards. That's not a problem. And like I say, just to say thank you very much.